January 23, 1942. Berlin, Germany. The air was thick with smoke, the streets eerily quiet as the weight of war pressed down on the city. Through the fog of conflict, Hans Albrecht sat in his tiny shop. The only sounds the rhythmic ticking of clocks and the soft scrape of his tools on metal. His hands, steady and sure, moved with the practiced precision of a man who had spent years fixing timepieces. Yet today, something felt different. The watches in front of him, once symbols of everyday life, now felt like ominous reminders of the world outside, a world spiraling further into chaos with each passing day. Hans was a simple man, a quiet soul who had spent most of his life in the shadows, hidden away in the corner of his small watchmaking shop on a backstreet in Berlin. His shop was modest, cluttered with timepieces of all shapes and sizes, some broken, some in need of the delicate care that only someone with his craft could provide. It was a life of routine, a life that had never called for much risk. But as the war deepened and the grip of the Nazi regime tightened, even a man like Hans could no longer remain untouched. The war had not arrived on his doorstep, not yet, but the signs were unmistakable. Each day, the city's once vibrant streets grew quieter. The cafes, once filled with conversation, now sat empty. The clatter of boots marching through the cobblestone roads became a constant soundtrack. The air was filled with the distant thrum of bombers overhead, the shudder of the earth as explosions rumbled through the night. Hans' customers were fewer and fewer, their faces lined with the same weariness that haunted the rest of Berlin. But it wasn't the war that had drawn Hans into this new reality. No, it was the ticking of the watches. Time, it seemed, had become something more than a passing moment. It had become a weapon, a tool for survival in a world that no longer cared for the ordinary. That afternoon, as the last rays of winter sun filtered through the grimy windows of his shop, Hans stood at the counter, working on a pocket watch for a man whose face he barely knew. The man had entered the shop quietly, his eyes darting around as if wary of being watched. His clothes were nondescript, but the slight bulge under his jacket hinted at a concealed weapon. Hans had noticed it, but said nothing. He never asked questions. Not anymore. The man placed the pocket watch on the counter, a frown on his face as he peered at Hans. "It stopped," he said, his voice low and strained. Hans nodded, his gaze fixed on the delicate mechanism before him. He could sense the tension in the room, but he had learned long ago to keep his thoughts to himself. He merely picked up his tools, his fingers moving with automatic precision. It was the only thing he knew how to do in times like these. Repair time. But as his hands worked, Hans' mind wandered. He had always been a man of peace. His father, who had passed away many years ago, had taught him the value of silence, the importance of keeping one's head down, of not attracting attention. It was safer that way. It was the only way to survive. Yet, despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved, the world outside his small shop had become inescapable. The Nazi regime's oppressive presence loomed large over Berlin. His neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their conversations hushed and full of fear. And while Hans had tried to ignore the calls of revolution, tried to remain neutral, he knew the truth deep down. He could feel it in his bones. His quiet life had already been shattered, and if he did nothing, if he kept his head down any longer, he would become complicit in something much worse than the war that raged outside. The man's voice broke his reverie. "I need this fixed. It's important." Hans nodded again, his fingers working faster now. He knew better than to ask why it was important. He didn't need to know. As he worked, Hans' thoughts turned to the larger world outside. The rumors of resistance movements stirring in the shadows, of people daring to fight back against the regime that had crushed all dissent. He had heard whispers of the underground efforts, of brave souls risking everything to strike at the heart of the Nazi machine. But he had also heard the price they paid. The Gestapo had ears everywhere. The slightest mistake could mean death, not just for those involved, but for their families as well. Hans had seen it firsthand. Men dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, never to return. It was safer to stay silent. It was safer to let time pass, to repair watches and avoid involvement. But as Hans worked on the delicate gears and springs of the pocket watch, He couldn't help but feel the weight of his own silence. The world was being torn apart, and here he was simply fixing watches, clocks ticking away, while the world outside seemed to be running out of time. The man waited silently as Hans finished the repair, his gaze never leaving the watch. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small envelope. Without a word, he slid it across the counter toward Hans. "I've been sent to deliver a message," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're needed. They know your work. The Resistance. We need you." Hans' heart skipped a beat. He had heard of the Resistance, of course, but he had never considered himself someone who could help. He was a watchmaker, a craftsman. What would he possibly offer? But there it was, an invitation, a call to action, the paradox of his life. A man who had spent his days fixing time was now being asked to fight against the very forces that sought to control it. The man stood up to leave, but Hans was still frozen. The letter was in front of him, an opportunity that seemed both impossible and essential. How could he refuse? But how could he risk it all? As the door creaked open, Hans finally spoke, his voice barely above a murmur. "What will happen to me if I say yes?" The man glanced back, his eyes hard and unreadable. "If you say yes, your life, as you know it, will be over. But if you say no, well, we both know the cost of silence." And with that, the man was gone, leaving Hans alone with the ticking of the clocks, and a decision that could change everything. October 15th, 1943. Prague, Czechoslovakia. The air in Prague was sharp with the chill of autumn, the city still bearing the scars of war. The streets, once bustling with life, now felt like a maze of shadows and broken promises. The war had settled into a heavy silence here, as it had in so many occupied cities, but beneath that stillness, something was stirring. It was the kind of silence that only war could produce, a suffocating quiet punctuated by the distant sound of boots marching across cobblestones. But in that quiet, Hans Albrecht was no longer a mere watchmaker. He had become something more, a man caught between the ticking of clocks and the ticking of a much darker time. Hans had never expected to be here. He had thought his role in the war would remain confined to the small repair shop in Berlin, a place where time passed in predictable increments, where a man could fix broken watches without ever wondering if he was fixing the world. But here he was, in a city that smelled of smoke and fear, the weight of a mission pressing on him. He had never wanted to be part of the Resistance, but now that he was, there was no turning back. The journey from Berlin had been long, and it had not been without its dangers. Hans had hidden the small bundle of tools and materials in his coat, careful not to attract attention. He had traveled with false papers, his identity a carefully crafted lie, but even that was no guarantee of safety. The Gestapo was everywhere, and Prague, like every other city, was a place where no one could truly be trusted. Hans had learned that lesson well, and yet, here he was, putting his life in the hands of strangers. Strangers who, like him, had seen the horrors of this war and were willing to do whatever it took to end it. He had been tasked with something he had never imagined, building time bombs. The Resistance had discovered something vital. The Nazis had been using the railways to transport weapons and supplies, and they had been using them to ship troops to the front lines. It was a vital artery for the German war machine, and if the Resistance could strike at that artery, they might slow down the Nazi advance. But they needed the right kind of weapon, something small, something hidden, something precise. And that was where Hans came in. As a watchmaker, Hans had the skills to create the perfect mechanism for a time bomb. He knew the inner workings of clocks better than anyone, and that knowledge could be turned against the enemy. A well-timed explosion could disrupt the Nazi supply lines, cripple their movement, and perhaps give the Allies the advantage they desperately needed. But as he sat in the cramped, dimly lit workshop that had been provided for him by the Resistance, Hans couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had made. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. He was a man who fixed things. But now, as his hands carefully worked over the components of the bomb, he wondered if he could truly fix anything in this broken world. Could he really make a difference? Or was he simply another cog in the machine, destined to be used and discarded when the war was over? The workshop was silent except for the soft ticking of the watches he had been given to dismantle. It felt wrong. His whole life had been spent surrounded by the ticking of clocks, by the precision of time. But now he was about to turn that precision against the very thing he had always sought to preserve. Time, he realized, had become both the enemy and the weapon. There was a cruelty in that, a sharp, bitter irony that twisted in his gut. He had been given a list of instructions, detailed schematics that laid out how to construct the bombs. The design was simple, but it relied on a perfect execution. Hans knew that one mistake, one wrong adjustment, and the bomb would not work. Or worse, it could detonate prematurely, killing him and anyone nearby. But in the quiet of the workshop, with only the sound of his breath and the ticking clocks to keep him company, Hans focused. He focused on the task before him, on the mechanics of it all. This was his world, after all, a world of gears and springs, of precise calculations. He worked late into the night, his hands moving with the fluidity of someone who had spent his life perfecting a craft. But the closer he came to finishing the bombs, the more he felt the weight of what he was doing. There was no turning back now. As the last bomb clicked into place, Hans stood back and wiped the sweat from his brow. It was done. The bombs were ready. But there was still one final test. They needed to be delivered to the resistance fighters on the front lines. And that, too, was a dangerous task. The Gestapo was closing in on every corner of the city, and Hans had no doubt that the resistance was being watched. One slip-up, one wrong move, and the bombs would never reach their target. He had been warned. This was a one-way mission. Once the bombs were delivered, there would be no more hiding. No more repairing clocks in quiet shops. No more peace. It was a sobering thought, but one that Hans could not afford to ignore. He had already crossed the line, and now he had to face the consequences. He glanced at the clock on the wall, a small pocket watch that had been passed down through generations of his family. It ticked steadily, the same as it always had, a reminder of a time before all this madness had begun. Hans didn't know if he would ever return to a life of repairing watches, of living in the quiet solitude of his shop. But he knew one thing for certain. Once you entered the war, you could never escape its grip. The time for running had passed. May 7th, 1945. Berlin, Germany. The streets of Berlin were different now. The rhythmic sound of marching boots had faded, replaced by the distant hum of Allied vehicles rolling through the city. The sound of war had been replaced by the dull throb of a peace that felt like an aftershock, a trembling in the wake of destruction. The air, once thick with smoke and the acrid scent of fire, now carried the sharp tang of freshly fallen rain. Berlin, the city that had been the heart of a monstrous regime, was now in the hands of the victors. The Nazis were gone, their empire reduced to rubble, their ideology exposed for the lie it had always been. But for Hans Albrecht, the victory felt hollow. He had made it through the war, but not without leaving a part of himself behind. He had come to Berlin in search of redemption, or perhaps for some kind of reckoning. He had been a man who, by the strange hand of fate, had been forced to fight a war not with weapons, but with time itself. A man who had once fixed the broken clocks of the world, only to become part of the mechanism that brought it all crashing down. His role in the war had never been grand. He had not stormed the beaches of Normandy or fought in the trenches of the Eastern Front. He had not been a soldier, a general, or a leader of men. He was just a man with a set of skills that had been used for far more than just mending broken watches. Hans had helped build bombs that had torn apart the Nazi infrastructure, slowed their war machine, and brought the resistance a step closer to victory. But no one knew his name. No one would ever know. Hans walked through the rubble of the city, the shattered remnants of buildings that had once stood as monuments to the Nazi regime. He could see the remnants of banners fluttering in the wind, tattered pieces of cloth that once proudly displayed the swastika. Now, they were nothing but symbols of a failed dream. But for Hans, there was no sense of victory in the ruins, no sense of pride in what he had done. He had helped tear down the walls of tyranny, but in doing so, he had also become something he could never fully reconcile with. His footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he made his way to his old shop, now a shell of what it had once been. The sign was gone, the windows shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It was just another casualty of the war, another forgotten building in a city that had paid a steep price for its sins. But for Hans, it was more than that. It was a reminder of the man he had been before the war, before the resistance, before the bombs. A man who had spent his days repairing watches, fixing the little things in life, never imagining that he would one day be called to fix something as monstrous as a war. The shop was empty now. No clocks, no tools, no repairs waiting to be made. The workbench where he had spent hours painstakingly fixing watches was covered in dust. It felt like a lifetime ago, the time when his only concern had been the delicate inner workings of timepieces, not the fate of nations. But now, in the aftermath of the war, he wondered if he had truly fixed anything at all. He sat at the workbench, his hands resting on the cold, empty surface. There was nothing to repair anymore. The clocks he had once repaired, the timepieces that had ticked away the moments of his life, were gone. They were destroyed, along with the world he had known. In their place, all that was left was the wreckage of a war-torn city and the ghosts of the choices he had made. Hans had been a part of something larger than himself, a movement that had fought against the darkness, against a regime that had sought to crush everything in its path. He had done his part, even if no one would ever know how small that part had been. He had helped to turn the tide of history, but at what cost? The lives lost in the name of freedom, the lives taken by the bombs he had made, they weighed heavily on him. He had built devices of destruction, but had he ever truly understood the consequences of what he was doing? The men and women who had fought in the resistance, who had risked their lives to bring down the Nazis, had done so with a sense of purpose. They had known what they were fighting for. They had understood the stakes. But Hans? He had simply done what was asked of him, as any craftsman would. He had repaired time, but never fully understood its power. Now, as he sat in the ruins of his shop, he realized that he had been just as much a part of the destruction as the men who had waged the war. He had helped dismantle an empire, but in the process, he had lost himself. As he stood up from the workbench and walked out of the shop, Hans caught sight of a small clock that had survived the devastation. It was a simple thing, a pocket watch he had repaired many years ago for a soldier who had never returned. The watch had been left behind, forgotten amidst the rubble. Hans picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing over the worn surface. The watch still ticked, steady and unyielding. It was the only thing in this broken world that still seemed to work,